There's something about quiet moments that stays with you longer than the loud ones. Back in Season 2, Episode 12, Better Angels, Rick and Shane face each other in that Georgia field at night. Just grass and darkness and years of brotherhood coming apart. Shane's been circling this confrontation for episodes, maybe since Rick walked back into the quarry camp alive. And in those final seconds before Rick drives the knife into Shane's chest, there's this detail that haunts me. Shane's hand lowering. He'd pull the gun, ready to kill his best friend and take his place. Then his hand drops, just slightly. Was it surrender? Was it manipulation? Trying to get Rick to lower his guard? Or was it something else, recognition, maybe, that he'd already lost what he was fighting for? The cameras linger on that gesture for just a moment before everything changes forever. What if Shane saw something in that field none of us wanted to admit? Something about who we become when the world stops pretending to be fair. Let's trace that question together, gently, through 5 theories that might help us understand what The Walking Dead has really been telling us all along. Shane Walsh saw the end of the world before anyone else was ready to accept it. Not just the walkers, not just the collapse of civilization, he saw what survival would cost. Back in Season 2, Episode 3, Save the Last One, Shane shoots Otis in the leg to escape a walker horde. He needed those medical supplies to save Carl, and the math was brutal. One of them had to die, and Shane chose himself to live. He came back to Hershel's farm, shaved his head to hide the evidence Otis had torn from his scalp, and told everyone Otis died a hero. The weight of that lie sits in John Bernthal's eyes through every scene that follows. Then there's the barn. Season 2, Episode 7, Pretty Much Dead Already. Shane breaks the locks and forces everyone to confront what Hershel had been hiding. Walkers aren't sick people waiting for a cure. They're dead. And pretending otherwise puts the living at risk. These things ain't sick, Shane shouts as he opens fire. They're not people. They're dead. He destroys Hershel's hope in front of everyone, forces them to watch walker after walker drop, and when little Sophia stumbles out of that barn last, Shane's face shows no surprise, just grim validation. The pattern is undeniable once you start looking for it. Every brutal choice Shane made in those early seasons, Rick eventually repeated. Shane executed Otis to save Carl. Later, Rick bites out Joe's throat to save Carl from the Claimers in Season 4, Episode 16. A. Shane wanted to kill the kid Randall rather than risk him leading his group back to the farm. Rick eventually builds a philosophy around preemptive strikes, killing the saviors in their sleep, executing Pete in Alexandria Street without trial. Season 1, Episode 6, TS-19, shows us Shane at the hospital during the evacuation, trying desperately to save his best friend. He hears gunfire in the halls, soldiers executing patients who can't be moved. The power fails. Rick's monitors flatline. And Shane, with walkers flooding the building and no time left, barricades Rick's door with a gurney and runs. That moment transforms him. He crosses a threshold from the old world into the new one, and he never crosses back. But here's what makes Shane tragic rather than just villainous. He genuinely loved. There's a scene in Season 1, Episode 3, Tell It to the Frogs, where Shane's teaching Carl how to catch frogs by the quarry. He's patient, gentle, present in a way that feels paternal. Carl looks up at him with complete trust. And watching that scene, knowing how it all ends, Shane dead in a field, shot by Rick and then by Carl, It's devastating. Shane wasn't wrong about the world becoming brutal. He was wrong about thinking love and survival followed the same logic. Rick's sheriff hat makes his first significant appearance in Shane's story when he sees Rick wearing it at the quarry camp. That hat represented authority in the old world, law, order, protection through institutions. Shane had been leading without the hat, without the title, just through necessity and force of will. When Rick shows up wearing symbols of the world Shane knew was dead, it must have felt like watching a ghost refuse to accept it's been killed. The micro payoff here is recognizing that Shane's pragmatism got validated by every season that followed. He was right that rescue wasn't coming, right that communities would fall, right that the strong would determine who survived, right that sentiment without strategy gets people killed. The show spent 11 seasons proving Shane correct about almost everything. But if Shane was right about the world, why did he have to die? Maybe because being right isn't enough. Maybe because seeing clearly without wisdom about what to do with that clarity is its own kind of blindness. Shane died in season 2, but he never really left. The Walking Dead kept bringing him back, not as a walker, but as a ghost haunting Rick's conscience. A voice asking questions Rick couldn't escape. Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, gives us Rick's final episode of the main series. He's being impaled on rebar, losing blood, hallucinating as he stumbles through the woods. And who appears to him? Shane. Not as he died bloody and Walker turned in that field, but as he lived, in his sheriff's deputy uniform, standing in the old King County Sheriff's Station. They're back where it started, before Atlanta, before Walker's, when they were just partners and best friends. Let me ask you something, hallucination Shane says. And if you've been watching since season 1, you know that phrase. It's Shane's tell, his way of pushing uncomfortable truths into conversations. And Rick, dying, finally engages with the Shane he's been carrying in his head for 7 years. He talks about Judith, about Carl, about trying to build something worth protecting. And Shane, in this vision Rick's dying mind creates, understands, or maybe Rick finally allows himself to believe Shane would have understood. I got us into this, Rick says. And Shane, his best friend, the man he killed, the ghost he's been arguing with through every hard choice, tells him that's not how it was. The absolution Rick needed, given by the version of Shane that only exists in Rick's guilt and grief. Jon Bernthal's return for that episode, filmed years after Shane's death, shows how central Shane remained to Rick's emotional architecture. The show could have brought back anyone for Rick's farewell hallucinations. They chose Shane first, before Hershel, before Sasha, because Shane was the original question. How far do you go to protect your people? And Rick spent 7 seasons answering it. But Shane's ghost appears in other forms too. Season 8, Episode 1, Mercy, watch Negan's mannerisms. The way he tilts his head, that familiar, let me ask you something cadence, the way he uses violence as communication. Negan is what Shane might have become if he'd survived long enough to build an empire instead of dying for a family. The showrunners confirmed they wrote Negan with Shane's energy in mind, and Jeffrey D. Morgan plays it perfectly. Shane's brutal pragmatism scaled up and stripped of the desperate love that made Shane tragic. Then there's Judith. The show never confirms it definitively, but the timeline and Laurie's own uncertainty make it clear. Shane is likely Judith's biological father. She carries his genes, Rick's name, and Michonne's raising. When Judith picks up Rick's python in later seasons, when she wears that sheriff's hat her father, whichever father you mean, left behind, she's a living embodiment of the question Shane and Rick argued over: nature or nurture, survival instinct, or learned values. In interviews, Bernthal himself said about Shane, "That motherfucker was right. He meant it about the brutality required to survive, about seeing the world clearly when everyone else was clinging to hope." And the show seems to agree with him, which is why Shane's presence echoes through Rick's increasingly dark choices, through Negan's philosophy, through the very structure of every community that follows Alexandria's walls, the centuries' tribute system, the Commonwealth's stratification. Rick couldn't let Shane go because Shane represented the part of himself Rick fought against for years before finally accepting. Every time Rick made a hard choice, executing Pete, slaughtering Terminus residents, threatening to kill Negan with his bare hands, he was becoming what Shane tried to teach him to be. The ghost wasn't haunting Rick. Rick was slowly becoming the ghost. The hat sits at the center of this haunting. Rick wore it. Carl inherited it. Judith carries it now. But Shane never got to wear it, never got the symbol of authority he'd been carrying through actions since the quarry. Maybe that's fitting. Shane was never about symbols. He was about survival. And symbols, as he might have said, don't stop bullets. But here's where we have to be honest about Shane. For all his clarity about survival, there were things he could never have built. The counter-argument matters, because Shane wasn't just early, he was incomplete. Season 1, Episode 6, TS-19, includes a scene that's easy to miss in the chaos of the CDC self-destruct sequence. Shane's drunk, and he corners Lori in the recreation room. He's aggressive, insistent, crossing lines that his desperation and alcohol blur but don't excuse. Lori has to physically fight him off. It's an assault, and it reveals something crucial about Shane. When his need collides with someone else's autonomy, he chooses his need, every time. That's not just a character flaw. It's a disqualification from the kind of leadership that builds lasting communities. Alexandria, which Rick eventually helped stabilize in seasons 5 and 6, requires negotiation. The Hilltop Alliance, the Kingdom trade routes, the coalition against the Saviors, all of these demand the ability to see other people as partners rather than resources or threats. Shane couldn't do that. His worldview was too binary. You're with me, or you're a liability. Think about Rick's evolution across the series. He starts as Shane's opposite, trusting, hopeful, believing in rescue. By season 5, he's absorbed many of Shane's survival instincts. But Rick also learns from Hershel's faith, from Dale's moral anchoring, from Michonne's balance of strength and compassion. Rick becomes a synthesis. Shane's clarity about threats, filtered through values, Shane never developed. That synthesis is what allows Rick to build the coalition, to make peace with the kingdom, to eventually sacrifice himself, trying to save everyone rather than just his inner circle. Shane's obsession with Lori and Carl demonstrates the fatal limitation. He loved them, genuinely, but his love was possessive, tied to his sense of purpose and identity. When Rick returned, Shane couldn't accept that Lori chose her husband. Every decision Shane made afterward was corrupted by that inability to let go, trying to prove he was the better protector, the stronger leader, the man who should be raising Carl. His pragmatism, which was his strength, got twisted by obsession into something dangerous. The barn scene in Pretty Much Dead Already shows both sides. Shane's right that walkers in the barn are a threat. He's right that Hershel's hope is dangerous denial. But his method, publicly destroying an old man's faith, forcing everyone to execute neighbors and family members, traumatizing Maggie and Beth, that's not leadership. That's forcing submission. And the difference matters. Here's the thought that sits with me. Shane could have been an incredible advisor, a tactical genius under someone with better judgment. In another timeline, maybe Shane survives and Rick learns to use him the way later leaders use enforcers Daryl for Alexandria, Negan for the Whisperer War. Shane's clarity about threats paired with someone else's wisdom about values could have been powerful. Instead, Shane's inability to follow, to trust, to build rather than just protect, that became his doom. Rick evolved by learning from multiple people. Shane stayed rigid, convinced his vision was the only valid one. And in the apocalypse, rigidity breaks. The act I close. Shane was the prophet who saw what was coming. Rick became the proof that you could accept Shane's truths without becoming Shane's darkness. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that Shane died, but that he died too early to see that his methods and Rick's values didn't have to be enemies. They could have been a synthesis. But Shane never learned to share the burden, and that's what killed him long before Rick's knife did. The second theory is about a man who found himself by losing everything else. Daryl Dixon is the only main character who appears in all 11 seasons of The Walking Dead. Think about what that means. Everyone else died, or left, or disappeared into spin-offs. But Daryl stayed. And maybe he stayed because before the apocalypse, he had nowhere he belonged. After it, he finally did. Back before Walkers, Daryl was nobody. An abused kid who grew into an abused adult, living in his brother Merle's shadow, drifting through life with a crossbow and a motorcycle and not much else. The show hints at his childhood through scars on his back, through his flinching at sudden movements, through the way he isolates himself from affection, like someone who learned early that getting close to people means getting hurt. Norman Reedus plays this with devastating subtlety. Daryl's not broken in obvious ways. He's functional, competent, but he's alone in a way that goes deeper than physical isolation. Then the world ends, and paradoxically, Daryl starts to heal. Season 2, Episode 4, Cherokee Rose, gives us one of the most emotionally precise moments in the series. Carol's daughter, Sophia, has been missing for days. Everyone's searching, hope fading. And Daryl, gruff and seemingly indifferent, brings Carol a Cherokee rose from his search. He tells her the story how the Cherokee mothers cried when their children were taken on the Trail of Tears, and where their tears fell, these flowers grew. "I'm not fooling myself," he says. "You shouldn't either." But he gives her the flower anyway. Hope and realism, tenderness and practicality, all wrapped together. That's when we start to see it. Daryl's capacity for care that he'd never been allowed to express. The apocalypse didn't break him. It freed him. Suddenly, the skills his abusive childhood taught him, tracking, hunting, surviving alone, became valuable. The emotional walls he built became adaptive. And the found family at the prison, then Alexandria, then the road they gave him something he'd never had, belonging without abuse attached. Season 3, Episode 15, This Sorrowful Life, shows Merle's death and Daryl's grief. Merle, who'd beaten him, diminished him, kept him small. Daryl finds him as a walker and has to put him down. Norman Reedus' performance in that scene is silent sobbing, the complicated grief of losing someone who hurt you but was still your brother. And after that, Daryl doesn't go back to being alone. He stays with the group. Merle's death doesn't isolate him. It confirms that he's built something bigger than blood family. Season 5, Episode 8, Coda, ends with Beth's death. Daryl carries her body out of Grady Memorial Hospital, and his face is destroyed. Not because Beth was romantic love. Some fans think so. Others don't. The show deliberately leaves it ambiguous, but because she represented innocence he'd been trying to protect. She saw good in him before he saw it in himself. Her death breaks something in him, but watch what happens next. He doesn't leave. He doesn't isolate. He grieves and stays. The crossbow becomes his symbolic object, self-reliance, weaponized, distance maintained, but not absolute. He can protect from range, care without getting too close, contribute without vulnerability. His angel wing vest, which fans obsess over with good reason, marks him as a reluctant guardian. Someone carrying weight he never asked for, but can't put down. Here's the theory's core. Daryl Dixon is the only character the apocalypse healed instead of broke. Not completely, he still struggles with connection, still defaults to isolation under stress. But Season 1, Daryl wouldn't have comforted Judith. Season 11, Daryl leads communities, makes speeches, carries hope. The end of civilization gave him the first real family he'd ever known. What does it mean when the apocalypse is your beginning instead of your ending? The Daryl-Carol relationship is The Walking Dead's longest and most complex bond. Neither romantic nor simple, but something that doesn't fit easy categories. Across 11 seasons, they orbit each other. Close, distant, protective, wounded, always returning. It starts with that Cherokee Rose in Season 2. Carol's lost Sophia. Daryl, who barely speaks to anyone, searches for her day after day until he's injured and exhausted. When they finally find Sophia walking out of Hershel's barn as a walker, Daryl has to watch Carol's hope die. He couldn't save her daughter, and that failure bonds them in ways success never could. Through the prison, the road, Alexandria, the Whisperer War, they're constants for each other. When Carol's husband Ed was still alive in Season 1, he was abusing her, and Daryl recognized it instantly. Two people carrying childhood trauma, both learning slowly how to trust again. The show never makes them romantic, and that's important. Some fans desperately want them together. Others appreciate that intimacy doesn't require romance. The show respects the ambiguity. They love each other. What kind of love? The kind that survives everything. Season 10, Episode 16, A Certain Doom, shows Carol leaving Alexandria, taking a boat from Oceanside to process her grief over Henry's death during the Whisperer War. Daryl doesn't stop her. He understands running. But the last scene between them standing on that dock, everything unspoken Melissa McBride and Norman Reedus play it with a decade of history in their silence. "You going?" he asks. She nods. He nods back. No big speech. Just acceptance that sometimes people you love need to go, and real love means letting them. Then the spin-offs split them apart. The Daryl Dixon series takes him to France, searching for Rick, but finding something else, the origins of the virus, new communities, different kinds of threats. And while there's no confirmed canon for this yet, fan speculation runs wild about whether Daryl hallucinates Sophia Carol's daughter, now forever 12 years old in his memory, a ghost of what he couldn't save. If the show goes there, and some set photos have hinted, it would complete a circle. Daryl processing 2 decades of grief across an ocean, finally facing the guilt he's carried since that barn. Meanwhile, Carol's journey in The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, Season 2 was announced, brings her to France to find him. After everything after Ed, Sophia, Lizzie and Mika, Henry, the Whisperers, Carol's still chasing Daryl across continents. Not romance, something more stubborn than that. The person who understands what you've survived because they survived it too. Here's what strikes me about their dynamic. Some grief takes a decade to reach. Sophia died in Season 2. If Daryl finally confronts that loss in France in Season 2 of his spin-off, that's roughly 12 years of story time and real-world production time processing a single trauma. The show lets grief be slow, returning in waves, never fully resolved. Carol's cookies became a running motif, her way of nurturing when words fail, of creating domesticity in the apocalypse, of proving she's more than the damage done to her. Daryl's bike became his escape route, the thing that could take him away but always brought him back. Two people using objects to communicate what they can't say. I care, I'm here, I'll stay until I can't anymore, and even then, I'll come back. The question the spin-offs ask, can a bond survive this much distance and time? They've been separated before when Carol was exiled from the prison, when Daryl was captured by Negan, when Carol left Alexandria. But France is different. It's an ocean and years and separate storylines, and yet Carol goes after him. She always goes after him. Maybe that's the thesis of The Longest Goodbye. Real family isn't proximity. It's the people you'd cross an ocean to find, the ghosts you'd face together, the silence you can share that says everything that matters. Daryl and Carol found each other in the apocalypse, and they keep finding each other over and over, no matter how far they drift apart. Theory 3 is harder to talk about because it hurts. Season 7, Episode 1, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, Negan's lineup. Abraham dies first, defiant to the end. Then Negan turns on Glenn, and we watch something break that the show never really fixed. Glenn's final words, his face destroyed by Lucille, blood pouring from his mouth and eyes. Maggie, I'll find you. Not anger, not revenge, not even fear. Just love, and a promise he wouldn't live to keep. Steven Yeun's performance in those seconds is devastating. Glenn trying to comfort Maggie while dying, trying to make his last words matter more than his death. He dies still believing the people he loves are worth dying for. Still believing. Period. The overnight ratings told the story the show didn't want to hear. 17 million viewers for the season 6 finale cliffhanger. 13.5 million returned for the answer. The Walking Dead lost 3.5 million people who couldn't watch anymore. Some came back eventually. Many didn't. Glenn's death crossed a line for them, not just gore, but the breaking of something essential. Because Glenn was the moral heart, not the loudest or most obvious moral voice like Hershel or Dale, but the living proof that you could survive this world without becoming cruel. Glenn killed when necessary, but never with pleasure. He led the first supply run to Atlanta that saved the group. He married Maggie and built a life in the middle of apocalypse. He forgave Nicholas for trying to kill him. He spared a savior who begged for mercy. Over and over, Glenn chose compassion when pragmatism would have been easier. The pattern is undeniable once you see it. The Walking Dead systematically removes hope figures. Dale dies in Season 2, Episode 11. Judge, jury, executioner. Trying to stop the group from executing Randall. Trying to preserve the idea that they're still civilized people. His death leaves the group without a moral anchor. Then Hershel becomes that anchor, faith, medicine, wisdom. He dies in Season 4, Episode 8, Too Far Gone. Beheaded by the governor while still smiling, still trying to make peace. Then Glenn inherits Hershel's watch, a gift from Maggie, and Hershel's role, the gentle conscience. And then Negan kills him. After Glenn, who holds that role? Carl tries, but he dies in Season 8. Siddiq carries Glenn's legacy for a while, then dies. The show keeps killing the people who remind the group they're still human. And without them, the story becomes darker, harder, more cynical. The Walking Dead after Glenn's death is technically more realistic. The apocalypse would grind people down like this, but it's also less hopeful. Less about what humanity can preserve and more about what it must sacrifice. Here's where it gets complicated. Glenn and Maggie's son exists now. Hershel Rhee, born at the prison, raised after Glenn's death, appears as a young man in The Walking Dead, Dead City. And in Season 2 of that spin-off, announced for 2025, there's speculation that Hershel has turned dark, angry at his mother, for perceived failures, attracted to violence rather than peace. If that's true, it completes a tragic circle. Glenn died believing in goodness, and his son grows up learning the world doesn't reward that. Glenn's death was the moment The Walking Dead chose brutality over hope. You can trace every viewership decline, every fan complaint about the show becoming too dark, back to that October 2016 episode. The bat came down. Something broke. And maybe the show itself was what shattered not all at once, but slowly, as it realized it had killed the thing that made people believe survival might still mean something more than just not dying. Did killing Glenn kill something in us too? Maybe. Maybe that's what moral hearts do. They beat until they can't anymore, and then we have to decide who we become without them. Theory 4 asks us to look closely at something almost unbearable to watch. Hershel Green's final moments in Season 4, Episode 8, Too Far Gone. The governor has taken him hostage, using him as leverage to force Rick to surrender the prison. Rick pleads for peace, trying to convince the governor that they can coexist, and Hershel, on his knees with a sword at his throat, smiles. Not a grimace, not fear masked as courage. A genuine smile, soft and proud, as Rick speaks about building a better world. Then the governor swings the sword. The first blow doesn't kill him, just wounds him horribly. And Hershel, even then, doesn't scream. He looks at Maggie and Beth with love as the governor finishes the execution. Scott Wilson's performance in those minutes is masterclass acting. Hershel's face cycles through awareness. He knows he's going to die. Acceptance, he's made peace with it. And something else harder to name. Pride, maybe. Or victory. Because Rick is saying exactly what Hershel spent 2 seasons teaching him to say. That people are worth saving. The community requires trust. That violence isn't the only answer. The interpretations split 3 ways, and the show deliberately doesn't resolve them. First reading. Acceptance. Hershel was a man of faith. He believed in something beyond survival, and his smile represents readiness to face what comes next. He'd lost his wife to walkers, his leg to amputation, seen his farm burn. Maybe the smile is simply peace with mortality, the theological certainty that death isn't the end. Second reading. Defiance. Hershel knows the governor is going to kill him regardless of what Rick says. So that smile is his final act of resistance, showing he's not afraid, that the governor can take his life, but not his dignity. It's a smile that says, you haven't won, even as the sword falls. Third reading, and the one I lean toward, pride in Rick's evolution. Remember, Hershel spent Season 3 watching Rick spiral into paranoia and violence after Lori's death. Hershel was the one who pulled Rick back from the edge, who reminded him that leadership means protecting people's humanity, not just their bodies. And in those final moments, with everything falling apart, Rick stands in front of two armies and argues for peace. He's become what Hershel tried to teach him to be. The smile is Hershel seeing his values win, even as he personally loses. There's a line Hershel says back in Season 3, Episode 2. Sick? That resonates here. You risk your life. That's a given. The only thing you can choose is what you're risking it for. Hershel chose. He risked his life for the possibility that people could still build something better than might makes right. And in that field, Rick proves that possibility exists. Hershel dies, but the values live. The gesture of that smile, the silence while chaos erupts around him, the symbolic weight of the last true believer dying to preserve what he believed in those three anchors, make the scene unbearable and transcendent simultaneously. It's Walking Dead at its most emotionally complex. Brutal violence and profound meaning occupying the same moment. Here's what makes Hershel's death even more poignant. Scott Wilson returned to film the Season 9, Episode 5 hallucination scene. Hershel appearing to dying Rick in a peaceful farmhouse, telling him it's okay to let go shortly before Wilson himself died in real life. The actor's final performance was comforting Rick Grimes, telling him the struggle can end, art and life blurring in ways that hurt to think about. Hershel's smile haunts the series because it asks an impossible question. Can you die believing you've won, even when everything visible says you've lost? Can values outlive the people who hold them? The governor thought killing Hershel would break the prison's spirit. Instead, he made Hershel immortal. Every time Rick chooses mercy after that, every time Maggie fights for community, every time someone in Alexandria argues for taking in strangers, that's Hershel's smile, still winning. The pattern across The Walking Dead's 11 seasons is so precise, it feels intentional. Hope figures die so others internalize their values. It's a brutal but consistent narrative strategy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Dale Horvath, Season 2. The RV, the bucket hat, the watch he'd give to Glenn. Dale was the group's conscience when they barely had one, arguing against execution, torture, dehumanization. The world we know is gone. He says in Season 2, Episode 11, judge, jury, executioner. But keeping our humanity, that's a choice. That night, a walker disembowels him in the field. His death is random, senseless, exactly the kind of death that makes his philosophy seem naive. But watch what happens after. Andrea takes up his arguments about preserving civilization. Glenn inherits his watch and his role as moral voice. Dale's death doesn't end his influence. It forces others to carry what he represented. He becomes internalized rather than external, a voice in their heads rather than a person at the campfire. Hershel Green, Season 4. The farm, the faith, the limp from the amputated leg. Hershel teaches Rick that leadership means protecting people's souls, not just their bodies. He mediates conflicts, tends the sick, plants crops, because believing in harvest means believing in future. The governor beheads him to break the prison. Instead, Hershel's death crystallizes everything Rick will spend the next 5 seasons fighting for. The idea that communities can be more than survival pacts, that people are worth the risk. Maggie carries Hershel's faith. Michonne carries his gardening. Rick carries his insistence on trying for peace before resorting to war. Hershel becomes distributed among them, his values living on through their choices. Glenn Rhee, Season 7, the pizza delivery guy who became the heart. Glenn's death forces Maggie to become a leader, because someone has to carry what he believed in, that people are worth saving even when it's hard, that forgiveness is possible even after betrayal, that building something beautiful in the apocalypse isn't naive, it's necessary. Maggie names her son Hershel, carrying forward both her father and her husband in a child who represents everything they fought to protect. Carl Grimes, Season 8. The sheriff's hat, the dreams of rebuilding, the letters he writes before dying from a walker bite. Carl's death in Episode 9, Honor, hits differently than the others because he's a child who grew up in apocalypse and still chose optimism. His final words to Rick: "It can't be all about killing. It can't. It has to be more than that." Carl becomes the future Rick was fighting for, and losing that future forces Rick to question everything. But Carl's letters written to his father, to Negan, to the group become the franchise's thesis. In Season 8, Episode 16, Wrath, Rick reads Carl's words about mercy, about building a world worth living in, about choosing who you want to be rather than accepting what the world makes you. And Rick spares Negan. Against every instinct, against Maggie's furious protests, Rick chooses mercy because Carl asked him to. The dead son determines the living father's biggest choice. Here's the pattern. Each hope figure dies, and their death forces others to decide whether to internalize or reject their values. Dale taught conscience. Hershel taught faith. Glenn taught compassion. Carl taught mercy. And the survivors carry these lessons not because the teachers are alive to enforce them, but because their deaths made the lessons sacred. The dead don't stay dead in The Walking Dead, not just as walkers, but as inherited responsibility. You can't shrug off Dale's arguments about humanity once you've watched him die believing in them. You can't dismiss Hershel's faith after watching him smile while dying for it. You carry them, or you betray them. There's no neutral option. And that's where the pattern starts to click, or at least it might. Maybe the show isn't about survival. Maybe it's about what we inherit from the dead and whether we're strong enough to carry it. The fifth theory lives in a symbol, Rick's sheriff's hat. It passes through 4 holders across 11 seasons, and each time it changes meaning. Authority becomes burden. Burden becomes inheritance. Inheritance becomes possibility. Rick wears it first. King County Sheriff's Deputy Rick Grimes riding into Atlanta on horseback in Season 1, Episode 1, Days Gone By, looking for survivors and hoping for rescue. The hat represents law enforcement, institutional authority, the old world's power structures. Rick keeps wearing it even as those structures collapse, and gradually the hat transforms from badge of office to security blanket, something familiar in a world gone alien. Watch how often Rick touches the hat in early seasons. He adjusts it when nervous, takes it off to think, puts it on to make hard choices. It becomes a ritual object, a reminder of who he was before he had to become who survival demanded. By Season 3, Rick rarely wears it anymore. It sits on surfaces, gets left behind, shows up in Carl's hands instead. Carl inherits it. Season 8, Episode 9, Honor, shows us Carl dying from a walker bite he got while helping a stranger. He sits in Alexandria's sewers, writing letters to everyone he loves, and the hat sits beside him. Carl's final request to Rick, it's got to be something more. It can't just be killing. It has to be about what we're gonna make it. The hat becomes a burden, then the weight of a dead child's hopes, the responsibility to build the world Carl wanted, but wouldn't live to see. Rick carries it differently after Carl dies. Not on his head, but in his hands. In Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, Rick's dying hallucination includes Shane, Hershel, and Sasha telling him it's okay to let go. But Rick fights to survive one more time, gets rescued by Jadis, disappears for years. The hat stays behind in Alexandria. Judith Grimes picks it up. Carl's half-sister, Shane's biological daughter, likely Rick's daughter by choice. She wears the hat in Seasons 9 through 11, and it means something different on her. Inheritance without memory. Judith never knew pre-apocalypse life. She never saw Rick wear a sheriff's uniform or believed in institutional authority. To her, the hat is family history, a connection to the father who saved her before disappearing. Kaylee Fleming's performance as Judith shows a child wearing legacy she's trying to understand. She asks Michonne and Daryl about Rick, about Carl, about what the hat meant before it meant her. And she grows into it not by becoming Rick, but by becoming herself while honoring where she came from. Then in the series finale, Season 11, Episode 24, Rest in Peace, Judith passes the hat to her little brother, R.J. Rick, and Michonne's son, born after Rick's disappearance. R.J. barely remembers his father at all. He knows Rick through stories Michonne tells, through the hat Judith gives him, through the legacy everyone carries. And that's where the symbolism completes its evolution. Rick wore authority. Carl carried burden. Judith held inheritance. RJ receives possibility, the chance to define what the hat means for himself, to build a world where sheriff's deputies and laws might exist again, or to create something entirely new. Carl's letters, read across Season 8's finale arc, become the franchise's moral thesis. It can't just be about killing. It has to be about what we're gonna make it. Every holder of the hat has to answer that question. What are we making? What's worth surviving for? The pattern across generations. Each person carries the hat differently because each person faces different challenges. Rick fought to preserve civilization. Carl tried to build beyond survival. Judith protected what remained. RJ inherits a world where the Commonwealth proves large communities can exist again, where rebuilding isn't fantasy. The hat survived when so many didn't. It outlived Shane, Dale, Hershel, Glenn, Carl. It waited through Rick's absence, and it keeps passing forward, generation to generation, asking the same question. What will you make of what you've inherited? Maybe that's the theory worth sleeping on. Legacy isn't about becoming your parents. It's about carrying what they gave you into a future they'll never see. The hardest theory to sit with is what Carl Grimes would have become. In the comics, Carl survives. He outlives Rick, becomes an adult, marries Sophia, Carol's daughter, alive in that timeline, has a daughter named Andrea. He becomes the bridge between the old world and the new one, someone who remembers before but built his life after. The Walking Dead comic ends with Carl telling his daughter stories about Rick Grimes, about the early days, about how humanity clawed its way back. That was the plan. Carl was supposed to be the emotional spine holding everything together, the reason Rick fought, the proof that fighting mattered. And then, in one of the most controversial decisions in the show's history, Scott Gimple and the writers killed Carl in Season 8. Not in battle, not protecting someone. From a walker bite he got helping a stranger noble. Yes, but also random and preventable and utterly devastating to the narrative structure. Chandler Riggs, who played Carl from age 10 through 18, found out he was being killed off right after buying a house near the set for his gap year before college. The decision blindsided him, the fans, and apparently Andrew Lincoln, who'd assumed Carl's survival was non-negotiable. Carl's death breaks something in Rick that never fully heals. Watch Andrew Lincoln's performance in the back half of Season 8. Rick moving through grief like he's underwater, mechanically making decisions, but empty behind the eyes. Everything Rick did, he did for Carl. Every compromise, every brutal choice, every community built was about giving Carl a future worth inheriting. And then Carl dies, asking Rick to build peace with Negan, to choose mercy, to make the world about more than killing. Rick tries. He spares Negan in the Season 8 finale, triggering Maggie's justified fury. He works to rebuild communities, to honor Carl's final wishes. But the purpose is gone. Rick's fighting now because he doesn't know how to stop, not because he has a clear vision of what he's fighting for. The show tries to transfer Carl's arc to Judith. She's Rick's daughter, she wears the hat, she carries his legacy. But it's not the same, and the show knows it. Judith is important, but she's not the emotional spine Carl was. We didn't watch her grow up season by season from child to adult. We didn't see her learn to shoot, struggle with morality, grapple with what kind of person to become. Judith arrives in later seasons already formed, already wise beyond her years, and that's narratively interesting but emotionally thinner than Carl's slow coming of age would have been. In the comics, adult Carl represents hope that children born into apocalypse can still be good people, can still build, can still choose humanity over survival pragmatism. TV Carl was heading there. His final episode shows him helping strangers, writing letters about mercy, dreaming of a future where communities trade peacefully. Then he dies, and that narrative possibility dies with him. Some fans argue Carl's death was necessary to free Rick to take bigger risks, that Rick's self-sacrifice in Season 9 wouldn't have worked if Carl was alive to protect. Others see it as the moment the show lost its way, prioritizing shock over story, failing to see that Carl was the point. Both readings are valid. What's undeniable, Rick lost the reason he was fighting. The man who bit out a throat to save Carl, who killed his best friend for Carl, who built Alexandria, and fought Negan, and spared lives, and took lives, all for Carl. That man didn't have an answer for what comes after Carl's gone. Rick's bridge, explosion, and disappearance one season later feels less like heroic sacrifice and more like a man who'd been hollowed out finally finding an exit. The hat passes to Judith, to RJ, and they carry it forward, but they're carrying what Carl should have become. And maybe that absence, that ghost of the future that should have been, maybe that's what really broke The Walking Dead's heart. Step back and look at all 5 theories together. Shane was right about the world. Daryl was healed by collapse. Glenn's death killed the show's heart. Hershel smiled while dying for his values. Carl's absence echoes through every season after. They all connect through the same tension: survival versus humanity, and whether you can have one without sacrificing the other. Shane saw clearly that the world had become brutal, and survival required brutal choices. He was early, not wrong. But his inability to balance pragmatism with love destroyed him. He represents the cost of accepting survival logic without preserving what makes survival worth it. Daryl found family when the world ended, healing from abuse through found community. He represents the possibility that apocalypse can create bonds stronger than what came before, that destruction makes space for new growth. But his healing only happened because he was surrounded by people like Glenn and Hershel, who insisted on preserving humanity even when it was hard. Glenn's death removed a gentle conscience, the living proof that you could survive without becoming cruel. His absence made the show darker, more cynical, more focused on cost than meaning. He represents what gets sacrificed when survival becomes the only value, from the people who remind you why surviving matters. Hershel smiled while dying because he saw Rick arguing for peace, saw his values winning even as he lost. He represents faith that teaching matters more than living, that influencing one person toward goodness justifies the cost of your own death. But his death also shows the brutal reality. The people who believe in something beyond survival are the ones who die for it. Carl asked his father to choose mercy, to make the world about building rather than killing, then died before seeing whether Rick would listen. His absence cost Rick the reason to keep fighting, the emotional anchor that made every sacrifice meaningful. He represents the future that should have been, the bridge between old and new that got severed too soon. All 5 theories circle the same impossible question. Can you accept the cost of survival without letting the cost become who you are? The show argues, over and over. Safety requires sacrifice. Communities need walls, and walls need defenders, and defenders have to make hard choices. Alexandria survives because Rick executes Pete without trial. The coalition defeats the saviors through preemptive attacks on sleeping enemies. The Commonwealth maintains 50,000 people through stratification and inequality that echo pre-apocalypse injustice. Every safe space in The Walking Dead is built on compromise, blood, and choices someone later regrets. The pattern is unbreakable. You can have safety or purity, but not both. But here's the alternative reading, the one that sits uncomfortably. Maybe the cost is the point. Maybe The Walking Dead isn't saying, this is necessary, but rather, look what we accept when we're afraid. Maybe Shane, the saviors, the Commonwealth leadership. Maybe they're not cautionary tales about going too far, but mirrors showing us how easily we justify the unjustifiable. Daryl's healing doesn't negate that abuse shaped him. Glenn's death doesn't erase that he lived with compassion. Hershel's smile doesn't mean dying for your beliefs is noble. Maybe it just means dying. Carl's letters don't guarantee Rick built the world Carl imagined. The tension never resolves because it can't. Survival demands sacrifice. Humanity demands preserving what makes us more than surviving animals. And The Walking Dead spent 11 seasons showing both truths simultaneously, that Shane was right and that becoming Shane is its own kind of death. That Glenn's way gets you killed, and that Glenn's way is the only thing that makes living mean something. These cycles we accept pragmatism over morality, safety over trust, walls over welcome they don't break. They just repeat, generation after generation, hat passing from holder to holder, each person deciding whether to carry forward the brutality or the hope. And maybe that's what the show was really about. Not surviving, but what you inherit and what you pass on. The spin-offs carry these questions forward into new territory, proving the story isn't ending, it's metastasizing into something bigger, threads spreading across continents and timelines. The ones who live reunited Rick and Michonne after years of separation. Rick, taken by the CRM helicopter, spent years trying to escape to get back to his family. Michonne, believing he was dead, finally found evidence he was alive and went searching. Their reunion in February 2024's limited series showed 2 people transformed by separation. Rick, broken by the CRM's military structure. Michonne, hardened by survival alone. But they found each other. They chose each other again. And crucially, they chose to go home together, to Alexandria, to Judith and RJ. That resolution matters because it proves something Shane never believed. Love can survive pragmatism. Rick became brutal, yes, absorbed Shane's lessons about hard choices and survival necessity. But he also held on to what Michonne, Carl, and Hershel taught him, that some bonds matter more than safety, that going back for the people you love isn't weakness, it's the whole point. The Ones Who Live also reveals the CRM's scope. A massive military organization with helicopters, hidden cities, resources that dwarf anything we've seen. They're experimenting on walkers, trying to solve the virus, building civilization through authoritarian control. It's Shane's philosophy scaled to empire, and Rick spent years inside it realizing that surviving without freedom is its own kind of death. Dead City follows Negan and Maggie into Manhattan, years after the main series ended. Negan, who killed Glenn, and Maggie, who lost everything to Negan's bat. The show forces them into uneasy alliance, tracking Maggie's son Hershel, named for her father and husband, who's been kidnapped. And here's where Glenn's shadow falls heaviest. Maggie can't forgive Negan, not fully, even after years and redemption arcs and Negan's genuine transformation. Glenn's death is permanent, unforgiven between them. Season 2 of Dead City, announced for 2025, reportedly shows Hershel Ree turning dark, attracted to violence, rejecting his mother's values. If true, it completes the tragic circle. Glenn died believing in goodness, and his son grows up learning that goodness gets you killed. The name Hershel carried forward both grandfather and father, hope figures who both died brutally. And if young Hershel becomes what they fought against, then Glenn's death truly did kill something that can't be resurrected. Daryl Dixon takes the franchise, Two Friends, following the virus to its origins. Daryl searching for Rick before the Ones Who Live resolve that plot, but find something else. A French community that suggests the outbreak might have started in Europe, that there are answers about the walker's origin that America never had access to. Season 2 brings Carol to France, reuniting the show's longest bond across an ocean and a decade of trauma. What's brilliant about the spin-offs is they don't answer the central questions, is they distribute them geographically. Can you build democracy in apocalypse? The Commonwealth tried corruptly. Can you forgive the unforgivable? Maggie and Negan tested daily. Can love survive separation and transformation? Rick and Michonne proved it can. Can healing last when new trauma keeps coming? Daryl and Carol are still figuring that out. The threads still open are tantalizing. Will Rick and Daryl ever reunite? Andrew Lincoln and Norman Reedus have both said they want it, but it hasn't happened yet. Daryl doesn't know Rick is alive. Rick doesn't know where Daryl is. The two men who built Alexandria together, who survived Terminus and the Saviors and everything else, haven't seen each other since Rick's bridge explosion in Season 9. And Hershel Ree's potential dark turn threatens everything Glenn died believing. If Glenn's son becomes a villain, if the name Hershel becomes associated with violence rather than faith and compassion, then the inheritance broke. The hat passed, but the meaning got lost. The spin-offs prove the story isn't ending. It's spreading, and maybe that's the final truth. There is no conclusion to the question of how to survive while staying human. There's just each generation answering it again, in new contexts, with new costs. Come back to Shane one more time, to that quiet Georgia field where it all shifted, his hand lowering before Rick's knife struck. We've traced his ghost through Rick's choices, through Judith's blood, through every brutal decision the show validated over 11 seasons. Shane saw the end coming. No one believed him. And by the time everyone caught up, he was long dead and buried at Hershel's farm. But Shane's presence never left. It lived in Rick's transformation from sheriff to survivor to something harder to name. It echoed in Negan's brutal efficiency, in the governor's empire building, in every antagonist who understood that strength determines survival. Shane was the first one to say it out loud. Sentiment is a luxury the apocalypse can't afford. And the show spent 11 seasons asking, was he right? The answers distribute across all 5 theories. Shane was right about the world's brutality, but wrong about love being weakness. Rick proved you can be both brutal and loving. Daryl's healing showed that collapse creates space for new bonds to form. Glenn's death removed the heart, but proved that dying for your values means something. Hershel's smile demonstrated faith outliving the faithful. Carl's letters insisted the future can be different than the past. All true, all contradictory, all necessary. The hat sits at the center of these contradictions. Rick wore authority. Carl carried burden. Judith holds inheritance. RJ receives possibility. Each generation answers the same questions differently. What are we building? Who are we becoming? What do we carry from the people we've lost? And maybe that's the only answer that matters. We carry them. Dale in Andrea's arguments. Hershel in Maggie's faith. Glenn in the way people still choose compassion when pragmatism would be easier. Carl in Rick's final choices. Shane in the uncomfortable truth that survival sometimes demands what we wish it didn't. The door Shane opened in that hospital, barricading Rick inside. Before fleeing the soldiers and walkers, that door never closed. It led to the quarry camp, to the farm, to the prison, Alexandria, the Commonwealth. It led to Rick becoming what Shane tried to teach him. It led to 11 seasons of asking how much humanity you can sacrifice before survival stops being worth it. The Walking Dead doesn't answer that question. It can't, because the answer changes depending on who's asking, what they're protecting, what they've already lost. Shane's hand lowering in that field, was it surrender, manipulation, or recognition that he'd already lost what mattered? All 3, maybe. Shane could see the world clearly, but couldn't see his own heart. He knew what survival cost, but not what it was worth. He was the prophet who got the message right, but the meaning wrong. And Rick, Carl, Judith, RJ, they inherited both the message and the burden of finding better meaning. Picture the hat on a hook now, waiting, not on someone's head, not actively being worn, just hanging there in Alexandria or the Commonwealth or wherever the Grimes family ended up, available for whoever needs to carry it next. It's been authority, burden, inheritance, possibility. What will it be tomorrow? We carry the dead. That's not metaphor. It's observable fact across 11 seasons and multiple spin-offs. The people who die keep shaping the people who live. Their values, their sacrifices, their failures, their hopes. Shane shapes Rick, shapes Carl, shapes Judith, shapes RJ. The chain continues, each link forged from what came before, but not determined by it. Maybe that's what these theories have been circling. Not answers about who was right or wrong, but questions about what we inherit and what we pass on. Do we carry forward Shane's clarity about threats or his blindness about love? Daryl's healing or his isolation? Glenn's compassion or the lesson that compassion gets you killed? Hershel's faith or the evidence that faith can't stop swords? Carl's hope or the reality that hope dies young? All of it. We carry all of it, contradictions intact, because that's what it means to survive something that should have killed us. That quiet field, a hand lowering, a choice that echoed for 11 seasons. And somewhere, in another field or city or road, someone else is making the next choice that will echo for years to come. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake, think about what you carry and whether it's worth the wait.